The village of Little Brambleford lay folded into the gentle Sussex countryside like a well-loved piece of embroidery, its hedgerows neatly stitched, its lanes softened by time and familiarity. In early autumn of 1954, the air held that particular English mixture of damp earth, fading roses, and wood smoke that suggested both comfort and quiet decay. It was the sort of village where nothing of consequence was supposed to happen, and yet, Miss Jane Marple had long observed, such places often concealed the most interesting human failings. Miss Marple herself sat by the front window of Rosebank Cottage, a modest red brick house with white painted trim and a garden that was the pride of Little Brambleford. Her knitting rested in her lap, though her needles were still. Instead, her pale blue eyes observed the village green opposite, where preparations were under way for the annual harvest Thanksgiving fete. Tables were being carried from the parish hall, bunting strung with varying degrees of success, and Mrs. Porter, who took it upon herself to organize all communal events, was already issuing sharp instructions in a voice that brooked no dissent. Miss Marple smiled faintly, just like Mrs. Denver's cake committee in St. Mary Mead. She murmured to herself, so much authority vested in such small hands. Her maid, Cherry Baker, entered with the tea-tray. Cherry was young, brisk, and inclined to regard Miss Marple with a mixture of affection and mild concern, especially when the older lady fell into reflective silences. "Tea's ready, miss," Cherry said cheerfully. "And you'll never guess who's come back to Little Brambleford." Miss Marple took her cup. "Oh, I dare say I might," she said mildly. "There are only so many people who ever truly leave villages like this." Cherry lowered her voice dramatically. "Sir Giles Harrowdene, back at Harrowdene Manor. Mrs. Porter says it's for good this time." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "Indeed, that is interesting." Harrowdene Manor stood at the edge of the village, a handsome Georgian house with long windows and a gravel drive bordered by yew trees clipped into rather severe shapes. It had been empty for years, ever since Sir Giles's wife died, and he began dividing his time between London and the Continent. Sir Giles Harrowdene was not universally liked. Wealthy, opinionated, and possessed of a sharp tongue, he had made enemies as easily as he made charitable donations. Still, he was an undeniable pillar of Little Brambleford's identity. "Mrs. Porter says he's planning to announce something at the fete," Cherry added, "something to do with the manor." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Announcements rarely bring uncomplicated happiness," she said, "particularly when property and pride are involved. Harrowdene Manor, if Miss Marple's cottage represented gentle domesticity, Harrowdene Manor embodied quiet authority. Its rooms were filled with polished furniture, Persian rugs softened by age, and portraits of Harrowdene ancestors whose expressions suggested that disapproval was a hereditary trait. Sir Giles Harrowdene sat in his study, frowning at a sheaf of papers. At 68, he was still a tall man, though stooped now, with iron, grey hair and eyes that missed very little. Across from him stood Clara Whitcomb, his secretary of many years. Clara was in her 40s, efficient, composed, and, some whispered, far too invested in her employer's affairs. "These figures are quite clear, Sir Giles," she said. "If the trust is altered now, it will cause difficulties." Sir Giles snorted. "Difficulties for whom? People grow far too comfortable assuming what will be left to them." "There will be objections," Clara said carefully. "From your nephew, at the very least. Edward," Sir Giles's mouth tightened, "Edward has never forgiven me for having opinions." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Edward Harrowdene appeared at the study door. In his early 30s, Edward was handsome in a restless, slightly careless way. His tweed jacket looked expensive but rumpled, as though he resisted any suggestion of discipline. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Edward said lightly. "You usually are," Sir Giles replied. "What do you want?" Edward smiled, though there was an edge to it. "I hear you're staying on in Little Brambleford. Permanently, so it seems. And I also hear there's an announcement planned." Sir Giles leaned back in his chair. "Village gossip travels faster than influenza." Edward shrugged. "People are curious, especially when livelihoods might be affected." "Your livelihood?" Sir Giles corrected. Edward's smile faded. "I work hard enough." "On projects that never quite materialize," Sir Giles said coldly. "You have potential, Edward. You squander it." Clara cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should discuss this another time." Sir Giles waved her away. "No, let him hear it. I am tired of tiptoeing around expectations." Edward's jaw tightened. "You enjoy provoking people." "I enjoy honesty," Sir Giles snapped. Edward turned on his heel and left without another word. Clara watched him go, unease flickering across her composed face. "You do make things difficult for yourself, Sir Giles." Sir Giles smiled thinly. "At my age, one must be allowed a few indulgences." The forgotten diary later that afternoon, in a quiet upstairs room of Rosebank Cottage, Miss Marple stood before an old oak chest. Cherry hovered nearby, curious. "You said this diary might be important," Cherry asked. Miss Marple lifted a small, leather-bound book, its cover faded and edges worn. "It belonged to my dear friend Matilda Grayson," she said softly. "She lived in Little Brambleford during the war years, a most observant woman. And you forgot all about it." "I mislaid it," Miss Marple corrected gently. "There is a difference." She opened the diary and glanced at the careful, slanted handwriting. Dates from years ago filled the pages, observations about neighbours, small incidents, overheard remarks. Matilda always said people reveal themselves when they think no one is watching. Miss Marple said she had a gift for noticing such moments. Cherry smiled politely, though she clearly did not see how old gossip could be of much use now. Miss Marple, however, felt a faint stirring of intuition, an almost imperceptible sense that this forgotten diary might soon prove far more relevant than either of them imagined. The harvest fete, the day of the harvest Thanksgiving fete, dawned bright and cool. The village green was transformed into a cheerful sprawl of stalls, jam jars, and flower arrangements. Children ran about clutching toffee apples, while older villagers exchanged news under the pretence of admiring chrysanthemums. Miss Marple arrived promptly at 11, wearing a neatly pressed grey coat and her best felt hat. She took in the scene with quiet satisfaction. At the tea tent, Mrs. Porter presided like a benevolent general. Nearby stood Reverend Lionel Brooke, the mild-mannered vicar, engaged in earnest conversation with Margaret Fenwick, a local widow who ran the village shop and seemed to know everyone's business. Sir Giles arrived shortly before noon, leaning on a silver-topped cane. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "My dear villagers," he began, once silence had been achieved, "it pleases me to see Little Brambleford thriving. I have decided that Harrowdene Manor shall no longer stand aloof from the village." People leaned forward. "I intend to establish a charitable trust," Sir Giles continued, "with the manor grounds to be used for community purposes." A murmur of approval followed, though not everyone looked pleased. Miss Marple noticed Clara Whitcomb standing very still, her hands clasped too tightly. Edward Harrowdene's expression was thunderous, and Margaret Fenwick's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Sir Giles smiled, apparently satisfied. "Details will follow, for now. Enjoy the fete." Applause broke out. The band struck up a tune. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the small cluster of reactions she had observed. So many responses to generosity, she thought, and not all of them grateful. An unexpected death that evening. A chill crept into the air. Harrowdene Manor glowed warmly with lamplight as Sir Giles hosted a small supper for a handful of guests: Clara Whitcomb, Edward Harrowdene, Margaret Fenwick, and Reverend Brooke. The meal passed cordially enough, though beneath the surface tensions simmered. Wine was poured. Polite conversation skated carefully around the announcement. After supper, Sir Giles retired to his study, leaving the others to take coffee in the drawing-room. Less than an hour later, Clara went to fetch Sir Giles, only to find him collapsed beside his desk. The doctor was summoned. The verdict, delivered with regret, was heart failure. He was not a young man. The doctor said gently, "These things happen." Yet as the household settled into shocked quiet, Miss Marple, sipping her evening tea at Rosebank Cottage, felt an inexplicable shiver. The next morning Little Brambleford woke to tragedy. Sir Giles Harrowdene was dead, and Miss Jane Marple, recalling the long, forgotten diary upstairs, felt certain of one thing: this was no ordinary death. The news of Sir Giles Harrowdene's death spread through Little Brambleford with astonishing speed, propelled by the twin engines of genuine shock and irresistible curiosity. By 9 o'clock the next morning, the village shop had already heard 3 different versions of how he had died, each more dramatic than the last. Miss Jane Marple, walking carefully along the damp lane toward the village, reflected that death always sharpened people's memories, though not necessarily their accuracy. She stopped first at Fenwick's General Stores, ostensibly to purchase a loaf of bread. In truth, it was the village's most reliable clearinghouse of information. Margaret Fenwick stood behind the counter, her posture stiff, her dark hair pinned with unusual severity. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, a fraction too quickly. "Good morning, my dear," Miss Marple replied. "Such a dreadful business about Sir Giles, quite a shock to us all." Margaret pressed her lips together. "He was a difficult man, but I never wished him harm." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Of course not. People are rarely as simple as their reputations suggest." Margaret hesitated. "They say it was his heart." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "They do say that." She accepted her change and turned to leave, but not before noting the faint tremor in Margaret's hand. At Harrowdene Manor by mid-morning, Inspector Alan Pembroke arrived from the nearby market town. He was a solid man in his 40s, practical, courteous, and inclined to believe that life was usually exactly what it appeared to be. Miss Marple had met him before. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with a nod as they stood in the manor's entrance hall. "I imagine you've already drawn half a dozen conclusions." "Oh no," Miss Marple said modestly. "Only a few observations." Pembroke smiled. "We're treating this as a natural death. Still, procedure requires a few questions." The study remained exactly as Sir Giles had left it. Papers neatly stacked, spectacles on the desk, and a glass with a faint residue of sherry beside the blotter. "Did Sir Giles have any known heart conditions?" Pembroke asked Clara Whitcomb, who stood nearby. "None diagnosed," Clara replied, "but he had been under stress." Edward Harrowdene leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "You mean he enjoyed antagonizing people?" Sir Giles's butler, Mr. Harding, cleared his throat. Sir Giles had a glass of sherry before retiring, as usual. Miss Marple's eyes flicked briefly to the glass. "Was anyone else in the study that evening?" Pembroke asked. "No." Clara said firmly. He wished to be alone. Miss Marple said nothing, but she felt a familiar tightening of intuition. People were rarely as alone as they believed. Miss Marple's method that afternoon. Miss Marple sat in her sitting-room, with the forgotten diary open on her lap. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains as she turned the brittle pages. Matilda Grayson's observations leapt out with startling clarity. Sir Giles Harrowdene possesses a manner of making people feel beholden, which they resent even as they accept it. Another entry, Margaret F., conceals her emotions behind brisk efficiency, dangerously proud. Miss Marple's breath caught slightly. "These are not merely idle notes," she murmured. "They are character sketches." She continued reading. "Clara W., devoted but watchful, a woman who notices everything, and expects to be noticed in return." Miss Marple closed the diary thoughtfully. Matilda had lived in Little Brambleford during the war, when secrets were currency and survival depended upon careful observation. It seemed that her quiet insights might now illuminate the present, questioning the suspects. Miss Marple's first visit was to the vicarage. Reverend Lionel Brooke welcomed her warmly, offering tea and biscuits. "It's all so very sad," he said. "Sir Giles had his faults, but he meant well." "Did he?" Miss Marple asked mildly. The Reverend looked startled. "Well, yes, his announcement was generous. Generosity can wound as much as it heals," Miss Marple said, "especially when it comes with conditions." Reverend Brooke hesitated. There was some disagreement. Sir Giles intended to redirect certain donations. Some parish funds would have been affected. Miss Marple nodded. "And that displeased you?" "I wouldn't say that," he said quickly. "But change is unsettling." Next she called on Edward Harrowdene, who was staying at a small inn. Edward poured her tea with exaggerated care. "You're wondering whether I hated my uncle enough to kill him. I am wondering nothing of the sort," Miss Marple said calmly. "I am simply listening." Edward laughed bitterly. "He controlled everything, money, property, even people's futures. But killing him would hardly benefit me, wouldn't it?" Miss Marple asked softly. Edward's gaze hardened. "The trust he announced last night effectively disinherits me." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once. "That must have come as a surprise." "It did," Edward said. "A very unpleasant one." Her final visit of the day was to Clara Whitcomb, who remained at Harrowdene Manor overseeing arrangements. "I devoted years to Sir Giles," Clara said, her voice controlled. "He trusted me." "Trust," Miss Marple observed, "is a delicate thing." Clara stiffened. "Are you implying—" "No, my dear. Merely observing that those closest often know where the most vulnerable places lie." Clara's composure cracked, just for a moment. "He promised me security. The trust changes everything." Miss Marple made a mental note. A subtle discovery before leaving the manor. Miss Marple asked politely if she might see the study once more. Left alone, she examined the desk. The sherry glass still stood there. She lifted it delicately and sniffed. A faint bitter almond scent lingered. Miss Marple set the glass down carefully. "So," she murmured, "not the heart after all." Raising the stakes that evening, Inspector Pembroke visited Rosebank Cottage. "You've been asking questions," he said mildly, "only the sort any village busybody might." Miss Marple replied with a smile. Pembroke hesitated. "The doctor has agreed to a post, Mortem. Something wasn't quite right." Miss Marple nodded. "I am very glad to hear it." As Pembroke left, Miss Marple returned to the diary and reread one final entry. "When a person feels forgotten, they may resort to desperate acts to ensure they are remembered." Miss Marple closed the book. "Desperation," she said softly, "is always revealing." Outside, the village lay quiet, unaware that beneath its calm surface a murderer was growing increasingly anxious. Little Brambleford, having absorbed the shock of Sir Giles Harrowdene's death, now entered the more animated phase of mourning, one in which sympathy gave way to speculation. Curtains twitched with renewed purpose. Conversations lingered a moment too long at the post-office counter. The village had not felt so invigorated since the great jam-scalding incident of 1939. Miss Jane Marple, seated once more by her front window, reflected that suspicion was rather like mould. It flourished best in warm, damp places where people preferred not to look too closely. She turned a page of Matilda Grayson's diary. "Villages forget nothing. They merely pretend to." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How very true, my dear Matilda. The post-mortem Inspector Pembroke arrived that afternoon with the post-mortem results. Cause of death was poisoning, he said gravely. Cyanide, administered in liquid form. Miss Marple nodded. In the sherry. Yes, but here's the difficulty. Cyanide acts quickly. Sir Giles drank alone in his study. Did he? Miss Marple asked. Pembroke frowned. No one admits to being there. That is not quite the same thing. Miss Marple said gently. Red herring hash 1 Edward Harrowdene. Pembroke's investigation naturally focused on Edward Harrowdene. Edward was questioned again at the station. You stood to lose a considerable inheritance. Pembroke said. Edward leaned back. And gain what? A criminal charge. My uncle had a habit of changing his mind. Killing him would freeze matters in the worst possible way. Pembroke studied him. You were angry. Yes, Edward admitted, but anger isn't murder. Miss Marple, invited to sit quietly in the corner, observed Edward's agitation. It was real, but unfocused. Edward reminds me of a young man in St. Mary Mead, she thought. Always dramatic, but never thorough. Murder requires patience. Red herring hash 2 Margaret Fenwick. The shopkeeper's turn came next. Margaret Fenwick's financial records revealed overdue payments. Nothing criminal, but enough to suggest strain. She depended on Sir Giles's custom. Pembroke said. The trust would have changed supply contracts. Margaret flushed. I needed his business, but I did not poison him. Miss Marple noted the sincerity of her indignation. Later, in the village lane, Margaret confronted Miss Marple. You don't think I did it, do you? Miss Marple considered. I think you are proud, practical, and frightened of losing control. But poison is a very personal choice. Margaret exhaled shakily. Thank you. Red herring hash 3 Reverend Brooke. The Reverend's accounts showed a mysterious donation shortly before Sir Giles's death. A gift for church repairs. Brooke explained. Sir Giles changed his mind about the funding. Pembroke raised an eyebrow. And that upset you? Brooke clasped his hands. I prayed for guidance, not for death. Miss Marple watched him carefully. Reverend, she said, did you see Sir Giles that evening? Brooke hesitated. Briefly, I passed the study door. Did you go in? No. Miss Marple noted the hesitation, but guilt, she knew, often spoke loudly. This felt more like fear. The diary speaks again that night. Miss Marple sat up late with the diary. Another entry caught her eye. Clara W. keeps lists. She is always prepared. I wonder whether she prepares for disappointment. Miss Marple frowned. Clara Whitcomb, efficient, loyal, overlooked. A new clue. The housekeeper at Harrowdene Manor, Mrs. Collins, approached Miss Marple the next morning. I shouldn't say anything, she whispered, but Miss Whitcomb was in the study after supper. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Are you certain? I brought in fresh towels. I saw her leaving. This contradicted Clara's statement. Escalation. Inspector Pembroke searched Clara's rooms. In her drawer he found a small vial empty, but labelled discreetly, potassium cyanide. Clara's face drained of colour. It's for pest control, she said. Pembroke was unconvinced. Miss Marple, however, remained thoughtful. Too obvious, she murmured later, almost theatrical. A dangerous mislead that evening. Clara Whitcomb was arrested. The village exhaled in collective relief. But Miss Marple did not share it. She returned home and opened the diary once more. The most dangerous person is the one who believes they are owed something. Miss Marple closed the book. Clara had expected recognition, but she was too cautious to risk exposure so clumsily. No, Miss Marple said softly, the truth is still hiding. Outside the church bell tolled. Somewhere in Little Brambleford, the real murderer believed themselves safe. They were mistaken. Miss Jane Marple awoke early the following morning, the pale light of dawn filtering through the lace curtains of Rosebank Cottage. She lay still for a moment, hands folded neatly upon the counterpane, her mind already busy assembling fragments of truth into something resembling order. The village, she knew, had reached a dangerous point in its thinking. An arrest had been made, a suspect named. Human nature, always eager for resolution, would now resist any disturbance of that neat conclusion. But truth, Miss Marple had long observed, was rarely neat. She rose, dressed carefully, and made herself a pot of tea. Only then did she return to the diary, Matilda Grayson's forgotten observations, turning its pages with renewed purpose. One must always look for the person who benefits most from silence. Miss Marple closed the diary gently. Yes, she murmured, quite. The flaw in the obvious Inspector Pembroke arrived shortly after 9, summoned by a polite note requesting his company. "You believe we've arrested the wrong person?" he said without preamble. Miss Marple smiled apologetically. "I believe you have arrested the most convenient one." Pembroke sighed. The vial was placed where it could be found. Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Clara Whitcomb is too methodical to leave such a thing by accident. She had motive. So did several others." Miss Marple replied, "But motive alone is not guilt." Pembroke studied her. "Then who?" Miss Marple poured him tea. "Not yet. First, we must revisit the evening of Sir Giles's death, reconstructing the night they went together to Harrowdene Manor." Miss Marple stood in the study, eyes half closed, as though listening to echoes. "Sir Giles retires here after supper," she said. "He pours his sherry, but the poison must already be in the glass, or introduced moments later." Pembroke frowned. "Only those present in the house could have done it," Miss Marple finished. But only one had both access and an unusual familiarity with Sir Giles's habits. She crossed to the sideboard. "He always used the same decanter, did he not?" "Yes," Pembroke said slowly. "And who refilled it?" "The butler." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, he decanted from the bottle, but someone else prepared the glass." Pembroke's eyes widened. "You mean Margaret Fenwick's secret?" Miss Marple next requested a quiet word with Margaret Fenwick. They sat in the shop after hours, the air smelling faintly of soap and spices. "You once worked at Harrowdene Manor," Miss Marple said casually. Margaret stiffened. "That was years ago." "As Sir Giles's companion," Miss Marple continued, "after Lady Harrowdene's death." Margaret's face paled. "He promised me security," Margaret whispered, "then dismissed me without explanation." Miss Marple nodded. "And you returned to the village, proud and wounded." Margaret's hands trembled. "I did not kill him." "I know," Miss Marple said gently. "But you know something." Margaret swallowed. "Sir Giles was afraid. He thought someone was tampering with his drinks." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. The diary's key that evening, Miss Marple found the crucial entry. "M.F. harbours old grievances, but lacks the nerve. The real danger lies else, where devotion turns into entitlement." Miss Marple closed the diary. "Devotion," she said softly. "Yes." Confronting the inspector, Miss Marple met Pembroke once more. "The murderer is someone who believed Sir Giles owed them a future," she said. "Clara?" Pembroke asked. Miss Marple shook her head. "She believed in contracts, not revenge. Edward, he resented control, but did not crave recognition." Pembroke's breath caught. "Then Reverend Brooke," Miss Marple said quietly. Pembroke stared. "The vicar? He depended on Sir Giles's donations. The trust would have diminished his influence, and he alone could enter the study without suspicion. But the cyanide was taken from parish pest supplies," Miss Marple said. "Accessible to him. He slipped it into the sherry before supper, knowing Sir Giles's habit of drinking alone." Pembroke ran a hand through his hair. "We need proof." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then let us give him an opportunity to speak." Setting the stage, Miss Marple requested a gathering at the manor under the pretext of clearing misunderstandings. As the suspects assembled, tension thickened the air. Miss Marple stood calmly at the centre. "Sir Giles's diary," she said, holding up Matilda Grayson's book, was not the only record of observation in this village. Reverend Brooke shifted uneasily. The truth, Miss Marple continued, is that someone felt entitled to Sir Giles's generosity. When it was threatened, desperation followed. Her gaze fixed on the Reverend, and desperation, she said softly, is always revealing. The drawing-room of Harrowdene Manor had rarely felt so heavy with expectation. The curtains were half-drawn against the late after-noon sun, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Tea sat untouched on small tables, growing cold as those assembled waited, some with irritation, some with dread. Miss Jane Marple sat upright in an armchair, hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression mild but intent. Around her stood the remaining players in the tragedy of Sir Giles Harrowdene. Inspector Pembroke positioned himself discreetly near the door. Edward Harrowdene paced restlessly. Margaret Fenwick sat rigid, her handbag clutched like a shield. Clara Whitcomb, pale from her brief detention, stood very straight indeed, and Reverend Lionel Brooke hovered near the fireplace, his clerical calm stretched thin. Miss Marple cleared her throat. "Thank you all for coming," she said pleasantly. "I'm afraid I have rather upset everyone's routine, but then, murder has that effect, doesn't it?" No one replied. The calm unravels. We have all been circling the same facts. Miss Marple continued, "But facts alone are meaningless without understanding people, and people, I'm afraid, are very predictable." Edward scoffed softly. "If you mean to accuse someone, do get on with it." Miss Marple smiled at him kindly. "Impatience, my dear Edward, is rarely helpful. Murder requires patience. That is why you were never truly a suspect in my mind." Edward flushed but said nothing. Miss Marple turned slightly. "Margaret Fenwick," she said, "you were wounded by Sir Giles years ago, but wounded pride produces bitterness, not poison." Margaret exhaled shakily, relief and resentment mingling in her eyes. Clara Whitcomb, Miss Marple went on, "You were devoted, capable, and expected recognition, but you are a planner. A murderer who plans does not leave evidence to be found." Clara closed her eyes briefly. Inspector Pembroke shifted his weight. "Miss Marple, patience, Inspector," Miss Marple said gently. "We have only one person left." Her gaze moved, unhurried but absolute, to Reverend Lionel Brooke. The mask slips. The Reverend smiled faintly. "Surely you don't imagine—" "I imagine nothing." Miss Marple interrupted softly. "I observe." She leaned forward slightly. "You relied on Sir Giles's generosity," she said, "not merely for the church, but for influence. When he announced his trust, you realized your authority would diminish." "That is speculation," Brooke said sharply. "No," Miss Marple replied, "it is pattern." She lifted Matilda Grayson's diary. "My friend Matilda wrote of you years ago," Miss Marple continued. "She noted your need to be needed, a dangerous thing when generosity becomes expectation." Brooke's face darkened. "You had access to cyanide through parish pest supplies." Miss Marple said, "You knew Sir Giles's habits. You entered his study before supper, under the protection of your position." "That is absurd," Brooke snapped. Inspector Pembroke stepped forward. "We've confirmed the missing cyanide." The Reverend's hands clenched. The final proof. Miss Marple's voice softened. "You thought the death would be ruled natural," she said. "And it nearly was, but you underestimated one thing." Brooke glared at her. "And what is that?" "Women who observe quietly," Miss Marple replied, "and diaries that remember." She opened the diary and read, "Reverend B. smiles readily, but when generosity is withheld his eyes harden. I would not trust him with disappointment." Silence fell. Brooke's shoulders sagged. "I only meant to frighten him," he whispered. "He was ruining everything." Inspector Pembroke signalled to the constable waiting outside. Aftermath, the village absorbed the truth with subdued disbelief. The vicar's arrest shocked many, but Miss Marple knew shock was often a form of denial. Clara Whitcomb was cleared. Edward Harrowdene left Little Brambleford soon after, chastened but wiser. Margaret Fenwick reopened her shop with quiet determination. Harrowdene Manor passed into trust as Sir Giles had intended. Epilogue. Miss Marple sat once more by her window at Rosebank Cottage, Matilda's diary resting on the table beside her. "Thank you, my dear," she murmured. Cherry entered with tea. "Everything's settled now." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, "as much as such things ever are." She picked up her knitting. In villages, she reflected, people believe nothing changes, but it does, it always does. Outside, Little Brambleford returned to its careful comet's secrets, for now safely buried.